What happens when the most powerful woman in cybersecurity meets the most corrupt TSA checkpoint in America? When Dr. Victoria Hayes was pulled aside for a random screening that turned into a public strip search, she didn't know that the agents targeting her were about to destroy their own careers. Because Victoria Hayes wasn't just another passenger. She was the CEO of a company that held the security contracts for half the airports in the country. And when they violated her in front of hundreds of witnesses, she didn't just file a complaint. She rewrote the entire system with a single phone call that would shake the Department of Homeland Security to its core. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Victoria Simone Hayes moved through the world with the calculated precision of someone who had built an empire from algorithms and absolute certainty. At 42, she commanded Phoenix Cyber Defense Corporation, the largest private cybersecurity firm in the United States, with federal contracts that spanned from the Pentagon to NASA. Her company didn't just protect data, it protected the digital infrastructure that kept America running. Victoria had earned her position through a combination of brilliance, relentless work ethic, and an almost supernatural ability to see patterns where others saw chaos. Born in Oakland to a single mother who worked 3 jobs, she had clawed her way through Stanford on full scholarship, earned her PhD in computer science from MIT, and built her first security algorithm while sleeping 4 hours a night in a shared apartment in Boston. Phoenix Cyber Defense wasn't just another tech company. It was the silent guardian of critical infrastructure, the unseen force that prevented cyber attacks on power grids, financial systems, and government networks. Victoria had structured the company around a philosophy of total security integration, where physical and digital protection formed an unbreakable chain. This philosophy had led to one of her most lucrative contracts, providing comprehensive security systems for 47 major airports across the United States. The airport security contracts were worth $800 million annually. Phoenix Cyber Defense had designed and implemented the digital backbone that connected TSA screening equipment, biometric scanners, facial recognition systems, and threat assessment databases. Every time a passenger walked through a checkpoint, Victoria's algorithms were analyzing their risk profile, cross-referencing watch lists, and coordinating with federal law enforcement databases. Her systems had prevented countless security breaches and had become so integral to airport operations that replacing them would take years and cost billions. Victoria herself was the embodiment of controlled excellence. She stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room, and possessed a gaze that seemed to process information at superhuman speed. Her signature look was understated but expensive. Tailored suits in navy or charcoal, minimal jewelry except for a vintage Cartier watch that had belonged to her grandmother, and hair pulled back in a style that projected both professionalism and approachability. Her daily routine reflected her systematic approach to life. Every morning began at 5:30 a.m. with a 40-minute workout, followed by meditation, and then 2 hours of reviewing overnight security reports from her global operations centers. She personally reviewed every significant threat assessment, every system upgrade, and every contract renewal. Her executive assistant, Margaret Chen, often joked that Victoria knew more about Phoenix Cyber Defense's operations than some departments knew about themselves. The headquarters of Phoenix Cyber Defense occupied 12 floors of a gleaming tower in downtown Seattle. But Victoria's real domain was digital. She could monitor security networks from anywhere in the world, accessing real-time data feeds from thousands of sensors, cameras, and monitoring stations. Her corner office featured 6 monitors displaying constant streams of security data, network performance metrics, and global threat intelligence. It was a command center disguised as an executive suite.
Victoria's relationship with the federal government was complex but mutually beneficial. She had security clearances that most cabinet members envied, regularly briefed congressional committees on cybersecurity threats, and maintained direct communication channels with the Department of Homeland Security, FBI, and NSA. Her company's work was so sensitive that even her board of directors weren't cleared to know all the details of certain contracts. The airport security contracts had come to Phoenix Cyber Defense through a competitive bidding process 3 years earlier, but Victoria had essentially designed the specifications herself. She had recognized that traditional security thinking treated physical and digital threats as separate problems, when in reality they were interconnected aspects of the same challenge. Her integrated approach had revolutionized airport security, reducing both false positives and actual security breaches by remarkable margins. Her personal life was carefully compartmentalized but deeply meaningful. She lived in a restored Victorian mansion in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, where she collected first-edition books and maintained a rooftop garden that she tended personally every weekend. She was unmarried by choice, having decided early in her career that the demands of building her company would make traditional relationships difficult. Instead, she maintained close friendships with a small circle of equally driven professionals and made time for weekly dinners with her mother, who still lived in Oakland and remained skeptical that any job requiring this much travel could be healthy. Victoria's approach to business was built on three principles: anticipation, preparation, and overwhelming response. She believed that security failures were almost always the result of predictable human errors or systemic weaknesses that could be identified and eliminated through proper analysis. Her company's motto, "Security through Understanding," reflected her conviction that true protection came from comprehensively mapping and controlling every variable in a system.
The Seattle-Tacoma International Airport's Terminal B security checkpoint was operating at peak morning capacity when Victoria Hayes arrived at 6:45 a.m. The familiar rhythm of the screening process unfolded around her. Business travelers efficiently removing laptops and shoes, families struggling with strollers and car seats, and the steady electronic beeping of metal detectors processing the endless stream of passengers. Victoria had navigated this exact checkpoint hundreds of times over the past 3 years. She knew which lanes moved fastest, which TSA agents were thorough but professional, and exactly how long the process would take. Her routine was calibrated to perfection. Arrive at 6:45, clear security by 7 o'clock, and board her flight with time to review briefing materials in the gate area. She approached Lane 3, historically the most efficient for business travelers, and began the familiar process of preparing for screening. Her laptop came out of her bag in one smooth motion, her shoes were already loosened, and her minimal jewelry was already in her jacket pocket. She had dressed specifically for easy screening. No belt with a large buckle, no clothing with excessive metal, and no unnecessary accessories that might trigger additional inspection. The TSA agent manning the document check station was someone Victoria didn't recognize, which was unusual given her frequent travel through this checkpoint. Agent Marcus Webb was a recent transfer from Los Angeles International Airport, a man in his early 30s with the bearing of someone who took his authority very seriously. He had been at SeaTac for only 6 weeks, but had already developed a reputation among his colleagues for being extremely thorough and uncompromising in his interpretations of security protocols. Webb examined Victoria's driver's license and boarding pass with unusual intensity, holding both documents up to the light and comparing them multiple times. The process, which typically took 30 seconds, stretched to nearly 2 minutes as he scrutinized every detail of her identification. Victoria waited patiently, accustomed to occasional delays in the security process. She noticed that Webb was taking significantly longer with her documents than he had with the passengers ahead of her, but attributed this to his unfamiliarity with her frequent traveler status or perhaps a system issue with her boarding pass. Webb finally handed back her documents, but instead of waving her through to the screening area, he placed his hand up in a stopping motion.
His expression had shifted from professional scrutiny to something that looked suspiciously like suspicion. The secondary screening area was positioned just beyond the document check, a glass-enclosed space where passengers selected for additional inspection were processed away from the main flow of travelers. Webb escorted Victoria to this area, his grip on her elbow firmer than necessary, and his demeanor suddenly much more aggressive than the situation warranted.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Supervisor Janet Morrison was overseeing the secondary screening area that morning. Morrison was a 15 TSA veteran who had worked her way up from the screening line to management through a combination of rigid adherence to protocol and an unfortunate tendency to interpret every regulation in the most restrictive possible way. She had a particular reputation for conducting intensive searches that often seemed to target travelers who didn't fit her narrow definition of what a typical passenger should look like. Morrison approached Victoria with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, the practiced expression of someone who had learned to disguise hostility as professionalism. She carried herself with the authority of someone who believed that her government position gave her unlimited power over the passengers who passed through her checkpoint. The initial conversation between Morrison and Victoria was cordial but strained. Morrison explained that Victoria had been selected for additional screening due to what she termed irregular travel patterns and anomalies in her documentation. Victoria requested specifics about these alleged irregularities, but Morrison deflected with vague references to security protocols and classified procedures. Victoria's security clearances, which should have expedited her processing, seemed to have the opposite effect on Morrison. Instead of recognizing Victoria as a trusted government contractor with higher clearances than Morrison herself possessed, the supervisor appeared to view the clearances as somehow suspicious, as if someone like Victoria couldn't legitimately hold such credentials. The additional screening began with a standard pat-down, conducted by a female TSA agent named Sandra Kim, who clearly felt uncomfortable with the intensity of supervision Morrison was providing. Kim was professional and apologetic, but Morrison repeatedly interrupted the process to demand more thorough searching of areas that had already been cleared. Victoria remained calm and cooperative throughout the initial screening, understanding that TSA agents had difficult jobs and that additional security measures, while inconvenient, were sometimes necessary. She had personally designed training programs to help agents distinguish between actual threats and false positives, and she believed that the system would correct itself once the initial confusion was resolved. However, Morrison's behavior began to escalate beyond standard protocols. She demanded that Victoria empty every pocket of her carry-on bag, despite the fact that the bag had already passed through the X-ray machine without triggering any alerts. She insisted on manually inspecting every document in Victoria's briefcase, including confidential materials related to her government contracts that were supposed to be handled only by individuals with appropriate clearances. The situation deteriorated further when Morrison declared that Victoria's laptop required additional inspection because it contained suspicious modifications. The laptop was a standard business computer that Victoria used for non-classified work, but Morrison claimed that the security software installed on it represented a potential threat that needed to be investigated by TSA's technical specialists. Victoria attempted to explain that the software on her laptop was standard cybersecurity tools that were required for her work with government agencies, and that she had documentation proving that the computer had been cleared for travel by the appropriate authorities. Morrison dismissed these explanations and insisted that the laptop would need to be powered on and inspected by agents who clearly had no understanding of the sophisticated security software they were examining. The technical inspection of Victoria's laptop revealed the depth of Morrison's incompetence and prejudice. The TSA agents examining the computer were confused by security software that was more advanced than anything they had encountered, and Morrison interpreted their confusion as confirmation that the laptop contained suspicious materials. She began treating Victoria not as a passenger with legitimate government clearances, but as a potential security threat who needed to be investigated. The checkpoint area around the secondary screening station began to fill with curious passengers who were delayed by the increasingly elaborate inspection process. Victoria could see business travelers checking their watches and families with young children growing frustrated as the normal flow of passengers was disrupted by the spectacle Morrison was creating. Morrison's demands became increasingly unreasonable and clearly discriminatory. She insisted that Victoria remove her jacket and shoes for additional inspection, despite the fact that both items had already been screened multiple times. She demanded explanations for Victoria's travel patterns that went far beyond anything required by TSA protocols, asking intrusive questions about her business relationships and the nature of her government contracts. Victoria's patience finally began to wear thin when Morrison announced that she would need to conduct a comprehensive body scan, using equipment that was typically reserved for passengers who triggered specific alerts or had been identified through intelligence channels. Victoria pointed out that she had not triggered any alerts and that Morrison had provided no legitimate justification for such an invasive procedure. Morrison's response revealed the true nature of her motivation. She claimed that Victoria's attitude and resistance to standard procedures had elevated her to a higher threat level that required more intensive screening. In reality, Victoria had been completely cooperative throughout the process, but Morrison was clearly frustrated by her inability to intimidate someone who understood the system better than she did.
The confrontation reached a critical point when Morrison announced that Victoria would need to submit to a private room screening that would involve removing most of her clothing from manual inspection. This procedure was reserved for passengers who had triggered specific alerts or had been identified as legitimate security risks through proper channels, none of which applied to Victoria's situation. Victoria firmly declined to submit to what amounted to a strip search without legitimate justification, citing both TSA's own regulations and her rights as a passenger. She requested to speak with Morrison's supervisor and to have her attorney contacted before proceeding with any further invasive procedures. Morrison's reaction to Victoria's reasonable request revealed the extent of her prejudice and abuse of authority. She claimed that Victoria's refusal to submit to additional screening constituted a security violation and that she was now required to detain Victoria until the situation could be properly resolved by law enforcement. The absurdity of the situation was becoming clear to other TSA agents in the area, several of whom appeared uncomfortable with Morrison's escalating demands and arbitrary interpretation of security protocols. However, none of them were willing to challenge their supervisor's authority, even when it was clear that she was exceeding her legitimate powers. Victoria found herself trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare created by an incompetent supervisor who was using security protocols as a weapon to harass a passenger she had decided to target. The very system that Victoria had helped design to protect travelers was being perverted by Morrison into an instrument of discrimination and abuse. The morning that had begun as a routine business trip was rapidly deteriorating into a public humiliation orchestrated by someone who had no understanding of who Victoria was or what she had contributed to the security of the very airport where she was being detained. Morrison had chosen to wage war against someone whose power she couldn't comprehend, setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately destroy her career and reshape airport security across the entire country. The humiliation reached its peak when Morrison ordered Victoria to be escorted to a private screening room for what she euphemistically called enhanced security measures. 2 additional TSA agents, both male, flanked Victoria as Morrison led the procession through the checkpoint area. Dozens of passengers watched in stunned silence as one of the most powerful women in cybersecurity was marched away like a criminal suspect. The private screening room was a sterile, windowless space designed to strip away dignity along with clothing. Morrison's demands escalated to a full-body search that required Victoria to remove her blazer, blouse, and shoes while being examined by agents who clearly had no legitimate security justification for such invasive procedures. The violation was both physical and psychological, conducted with the deliberate cruelty of people who enjoyed exercising power over someone they couldn't intimidate. Victoria endured the humiliation with controlled fury, her mind already calculating the consequences that Morrison and her team were about to face. She memorized badge numbers, noted the specific procedures being violated, and mentally cataloged every regulation being broken by agents who clearly had no idea they were assaulting someone with the power to end their careers. When the degrading search finally concluded, Victoria was escorted back to the main checkpoint area where her belongings had been scattered across multiple inspection tables. Her laptop remained disassembled, her briefcase contents were strewn about, and her personal items had been handled by multiple agents in clear violation of protocols governing sensitive materials. Morrison approached Victoria with a smirk that revealed her satisfaction at having humiliated someone she perceived as arrogant and entitled. She announced loudly for the benefit of the gathered crowd that Victoria was being cleared for travel, but would be flagged in the system for additional screening on all future flights. The threat was clear: submit to our authority or face harassment every time you fly. Victoria collected her scattered belongings without comment, her hands steady despite the rage burning in her chest. She reassembled her laptop, reorganized her briefcase, and walked toward her gate with the measured pace of someone who had just declared war but was too disciplined to reveal her battle plans. She didn't wait until she reached the gate to begin her counterattack. Standing in the corridor just beyond the security checkpoint, surrounded by passengers who were still processing what they had witnessed, Victoria pulled out her phone and made the first of several calls that would reshape airport security across the United States. Her first call was to Michael Zhang, Phoenix Cyber Defense's chief technology officer and Victoria's most trusted lieutenant. Zhang answered immediately, recognizing Victoria's personal number and knowing that she never called during travel unless something critical had occurred. Michael's voice was crisp and alert despite the early hour. Victoria's tone was deadly calm as she delivered her instructions, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. She ordered an immediate comprehensive security audit of every TSA system that Phoenix Cyber Defense supported, with particular focus on identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile actors or incompetent personnel. The scope of Phoenix Cyber Defense's involvement with TSA operations was staggering. Victoria's company had designed the networking infrastructure that connected screening equipment across 47 airports, developed the threat assessment algorithms that flagged suspicious passengers, and created the personnel management systems that tracked agent performance and misconduct reports. They had access to databases, communication networks, and operational protocols that were essential to TSA's daily operations.
Zhang immediately grasped the implications of Victoria's request. A comprehensive security audit would require shutting down non-essential systems, reviewing personnel files, and examining operational procedures in ways that would be impossible to hide from TSA leadership. The audit would effectively cripple normal operations while exposing every systemic weakness and individual failure within the agency. Victoria's second call was to Senator Patricia Reynolds, the ranking member of the Senate Homeland Security Committee and one of Phoenix Cyber Defense's most important allies in Congress. Reynolds had been instrumental in securing the cybersecurity contracts that had made Victoria's company indispensable to federal security operations, and she maintained a personal relationship with Victoria that went beyond typical contractor-client interactions. Reynolds answered her personal phone despite the congressional hearing she was attending, stepping out of the chamber when she recognized Victoria's number. The senator listened in growing outrage as Victoria described the harassment she had endured at SeaTac, particularly the violations of protocols governing the handling of classified materials and the treatment of individuals with high-level security clearances. The political implications were immediately clear to Reynolds. TSA's abuse of a prominent African-American businesswoman would create a public relations disaster for the Department of Homeland Security, but more importantly, their mishandling of someone with Victoria's security clearances represented a fundamental breach of national security protocols that could not be ignored or covered up.
Reynolds promised immediate action, including emergency hearings on TSA oversight and a formal investigation into the Seattle checkpoint's operations. She also offered to personally contact the Secretary of Homeland Security to ensure that the incident received the highest level of attention within the administration. Victoria's third call was to David Martinez, the investigative journalist who had broken several major stories about government contractor fraud and agency misconduct. Martinez had cultivated Victoria as a source over several years, recognizing that her position gave her unique insights into the intersection of technology, security, and government operations. Martinez was already familiar with TSA's history of discriminatory enforcement and abuse of authority, having written extensively about the agency's problems with racial profiling and unconstitutional searches. Victoria's story provided him with a perfect case study of systemic dysfunction within TSA, made even more compelling by her status as a high-profile government contractor with impeccable credentials. The journalist immediately began preparing a comprehensive exposé that would examine not just Victoria's treatment at SeaTac, but the broader pattern of TSA misconduct that her experience exemplified. He had sources within multiple airports who could provide additional examples of discriminatory enforcement and supervisor abuse, creating a narrative that would be impossible for TSA leadership to dismiss as an isolated incident. Victoria's fourth call was to Robert Kim, Phoenix Cyber Defense's general counsel and a former federal prosecutor who specialized in civil rights violations and government misconduct. Kim had been anticipating this call since Victoria had first described TSA's escalating harassment, and he had already begun preparing legal strategies that would maximize both financial damages and systemic reform. Kim's approach would be multifaceted, combining civil rights litigation with contract enforcement actions that would force TSA to choose between defending indefensible conduct and implementing comprehensive reforms. The legal strategy would leverage Victoria's status as both a victim of discrimination and an essential government contractor whose mistreatment represented a breach of federal obligations. The fifth and most devastating call was to Admiral James Harrison, the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security and Victoria's primary contact for her most sensitive government contracts. Harrison had worked with Victoria on classified projects that were so critical to national security that their details were known only to a handful of senior officials across multiple agencies. Harrison's reaction to Victoria's report was immediate and explosive. The Admiral understood that TSA's treatment of Victoria represented not just a civil rights violation, but a catastrophic security breach that threatened ongoing operations essential to national defense. He promised that heads would roll within hours and that the entire chain of command at SeaTac would be held accountable for their failures. The speed of the federal response was unprecedented. Within 2 hours of Victoria's calls, emergency meetings were being convened in Washington. Congressional staff were preparing oversight hearings, and TSA headquarters was fielding urgent inquiries from multiple government agencies demanding explanations for the Seattle incident. The first concrete action came from Phoenix Cyber Defense's technical audit, which revealed that the Seattle checkpoint had been consistently failing security protocols and misusing screening equipment in ways that violated both TSA regulations and federal contracting requirements. The audit provided documented evidence that Morrison and her team had been engaging in discriminatory enforcement patterns that made the airport less secure, not more. The second wave of consequences hit when Senator Reynolds' office released a preliminary statement announcing emergency hearings on TSA misconduct and demanding the immediate suspension of personnel involved in the harassment of government contractors. The statement specifically mentioned the mishandling of classified materials and the violation of security clearance protocols, framing the incident as a national security issue rather than just a civil rights violation. The media response was swift and merciless. Martinez's initial reporting, supported by leaked documentation from Victoria's congressional allies, painted a picture of systemic dysfunction within TSA that went beyond individual prejudice. The story gained national attention within hours, with major networks picking up the narrative and demanding responses from TSA leadership.
The legal consequences began when Kim filed emergency motions in federal court seeking immediate injunctive relief against further harassment of Phoenix cyber defense personnel and demanding the preservation of all documentation related to the Seattle incident. The filings were crafted to ensure maximum public visibility while creating legal obligations that would force TSA to choose between transparency and cover-up. The most dramatic response came from Admiral Harrison's office, which announced a comprehensive review of TSA operations at all airports where Phoenix Cyber Defense provided security services. The review would examine not just the Seattle incident, but the broader question of whether TSA personnel were competent to handle the sophisticated security systems they had been entrusted to operate. By late afternoon, the earthquake Victoria had triggered was generating aftershocks throughout the federal bureaucracy. TSA Administrator William Peterson was fielding angry calls from congressional leaders, White House staff, and his own subordinates who were desperately trying to contain a crisis that was spiraling beyond their control. The Seattle checkpoint was effectively paralyzed as investigators from multiple agencies descended on the facility, interviewing agents, reviewing security footage, and examining the procedures that had allowed Morrison to conduct her discriminatory harassment. Normal operations were suspended as the entire facility became a crime scene in all but name. Morrison herself was escorted from the airport in disgrace, her supervisor credentials revoked, and her security clearances suspended pending the outcome of multiple investigations. The agents who had participated in Victoria's harassment were similarly suspended, their careers effectively ended by their decision to enable Morrison's abuse of authority. Victoria watched the destruction of her tormentors from the comfort of her first-class seat as her flight finally departed for Washington. She felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only the cold certainty that justice was being served through the systematic application of power. Morrison had chosen to humiliate someone whose influence she couldn't comprehend, and now she was experiencing the consequences of that choice. The war Victoria had declared from the corridor outside the security checkpoint was already won. TSA's leadership was in full retreat, congressional oversight was inevitable, and the media narrative was locked in place. Morrison and her team had destroyed their own careers through their treatment of a passenger who possessed the power to hold them accountable for their actions. But Victoria understood that winning the first battle was only the beginning. The real challenge would be ensuring that the victory led to lasting change rather than temporary embarrassment for an agency that had been failing the American people for decades. Within 72 hours of Victoria's calls, the consequences of her retaliation began spreading far beyond the Seattle checkpoint where her humiliation had occurred. The systematic dismantling of TSA operations that she had initiated was creating shockwaves throughout the entire transportation security infrastructure, affecting thousands of employees and millions of travelers across the country. The first unintended victims were the frontline TSA agents who had nothing to do with Morrison's discriminatory conduct. At SeaTac International Airport, the emergency audit ordered by Admiral Harrison required shutting down 3 of the 6 security checkpoints for comprehensive review. The remaining checkpoints were overwhelmed by passenger volume, creating delays that stretched to over 2 hours during peak travel times. Agent Sarah Martinez, a single mother of 2 who had worked at SeaTac for 8 years, found herself working mandatory overtime shifts as the airport struggled to process normal passenger loads with reduced capacity. Martinez had always been professional and courteous in her interactions with travelers, but she was now facing angry passengers who blamed all TSA agents for the delays caused by her supervisor's misconduct. The ripple effects extended to other airports where Phoenix Cyber Defense provided security infrastructure. Victoria's comprehensive audit required temporarily disabling certain automated threat assessment algorithms to examine their vulnerability to misuse, forcing airports to rely on manual processes that were slower and less efficient than the digital systems they had replaced. At Denver International Airport, the suspension of automated threat assessment algorithms meant that security agents had to individually review every passenger who might normally have been cleared automatically by Victoria's sophisticated software.
The additional manual screening created bottlenecks that delayed flights across the airline industry, affecting travelers who had no connection to the Seattle incident. The economic impact rippled through the entire travel ecosystem. Airlines faced massive costs from delayed flights, missed connections, and passenger compensation requirements. Hotel chains in major cities saw unexpected spikes in demand as stranded travelers needed overnight accommodations. Rental car companies struggled to accommodate passengers whose flights had been diverted to alternative airports where security operations remained functional. At Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, a family-owned restaurant that had operated in the terminal for 15 years saw their daily revenue drop by 60% as security delays prevented passengers from reaching the gate areas where they conducted business. The media coverage that had initially portrayed Victoria as a victim of discriminatory harassment began to shift as the broader consequences of her retaliation became apparent. News outlets started questioning whether the punishment fit the crime, particularly as stories emerged about ordinary travelers facing extended delays and missed family events due to security disruptions.
Dr. James Williams, a respected civil rights attorney who had initially supported Victoria's actions, began expressing concerns about the proportionality of her response during television interviews. Williams argued that while Morrison's conduct was clearly unacceptable, the systematic shutdown of security operations was harming innocent people who had no responsibility for TSA's failures. The political ramifications proved even more complex than the operational disruptions. Congressional leaders who had initially rallied to Victoria's support found themselves fielding angry calls from constituents whose travel plans had been ruined by security delays. Representative Angela Foster, whose district included Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, faced a town hall meeting filled with airport employees worried about their job security and travelers frustrated by the ongoing chaos. Victoria's allies in Congress began privately questioning whether her response had been strategically wise, even as they publicly maintained their support for accountability and reform. Senator Reynolds found herself in the uncomfortable position of defending security audits that were creating more problems than they solved, while trying to maintain her relationship with a contractor whose expertise remained essential to national security. The Department of Homeland Security faced an impossible situation as multiple crises converged simultaneously. Secretary Thompson was under pressure from the White House to resolve the operational disruptions, from Congress to demonstrate accountability for TSA's failures, and from the media to explain how such widespread dysfunction had been allowed to develop within a critical security agency. TSA Administrator Peterson became the focal point for criticism from all sides. Airport managers blamed him for the operational chaos, congressional leaders questioned his competence, and his own employees were demoralized by the constant negative coverage and uncertainty about their future. Peterson's attempts to defend his agency's overall performance were undermined by daily revelations about misconduct and incompetence at facilities across the country. The investigation into Morrison's conduct revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior that extended far beyond Victoria's case. Internal reviews uncovered dozens of complaints about excessive searches, racial profiling, and abuse of authority that had been ignored or covered up by TSA management. Former agents came forward with stories about being pressured to meet quotas for secondary screenings that disproportionately targeted minority passengers. The revelations about systemic discrimination created additional legal liability for the federal government as civil rights organizations filed class action lawsuits on behalf of passengers who had been subjected to similar treatment. Victoria's case had opened the floodgates for accountability that TSA had successfully avoided for years. But the financial costs of settling these cases would ultimately be borne by taxpayers rather than the individuals responsible for the misconduct. The technological audit that Victoria had ordered revealed vulnerabilities in airport security systems that posed genuine national security risks. However, addressing these vulnerabilities required shutting down systems for extended periods, creating operational disruptions that terrorist organizations could potentially exploit. The irony was that fixing the security problems Victoria had identified was making airports temporarily less secure. Phoenix Cyber Defense found itself in an increasingly uncomfortable position as the company responsible for both exposing TSA's failures and providing the technical expertise needed to fix them.
Victoria's employees began questioning whether their personal loyalty to their CEO was worth the professional damage being done to their relationships with other government clients. Michael Zhang, Victoria's chief technology officer, privately worried that the company's aggressive stance was damaging its reputation with federal agencies that valued stability and discretion over accountability and reform. Several pending contract renewals were suddenly subject to additional review, as government officials questioned whether Phoenix Cyber Defense could be trusted to maintain the collaborative relationships essential to effective security operations. The human cost of the disruptions became increasingly apparent as stories emerged about passengers missing critical life events due to security delays. A military family missed their father's funeral because their connecting flight was canceled due to TSA operational problems. A cancer patient missed a crucial treatment appointment when security delays caused her to miss her flight to a specialized medical center. Victoria began receiving messages from travelers whose lives had been disrupted by the consequences of her actions. Many expressed support for her fight against discrimination, but others questioned whether her pursuit of justice was worth the suffering being imposed on innocent people. The moral clarity that had driven her initial response became clouded by the unintended consequences of her retaliation. The international implications added another layer of complexity to the crisis. Foreign airlines began questioning whether they could rely on U.S. airports to maintain consistent security operations, leading some to consider alternative routes that avoided American airports entirely. The State Department received inquiries from allied governments about the stability of U.S. transportation security, creating diplomatic complications that extended far beyond domestic policy concerns. Airport employees across the country found themselves caught between competing pressures as TSA's crisis deepened. They were expected to maintain normal operations while implementing new procedures, cooperating with multiple investigations, and managing increased passenger frustration. Many experienced agents began seeking employment with private security companies, accelerating a brain drain that further compromised TSA's operational capacity.
The financial markets began reacting to the uncertainty surrounding airport operations as investors worried about the impact on airlines, travel companies, and related industries. Stock prices for major carriers declined as analysts questioned whether the security disruptions would become a permanent drag on profitability. The broader economic impact of Victoria's retaliation was beginning to affect retirement accounts and pension funds that had significant investments in travel-related stocks. Victoria watched these developments from her Seattle headquarters with growing unease. What had begun as a justified response to personal humiliation was evolving into a crisis that threatened to undermine the very security infrastructure she had spent her career building. The system she had created to protect travelers was being damaged by her own pursuit of accountability. The weight of unintended consequences began pressing down on Victoria as she realized that her perfect moment of righteous revenge was exacting a price from people who had never wronged her. Morrison's abuse of authority had been inexcusable, but the cure Victoria had prescribed was beginning to seem worse than the disease it was meant to address. Her victory over TSA was complete, but the cost of that victory was becoming impossible to ignore. The question she now faced was whether she could find a way to end the crisis she had created without appearing to abandon the principles that had driven her to fight in the first place. The call that would force Victoria to confront the true cost of her retaliation came at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the Seattle incident had triggered nationwide TSA disruptions. The caller was General Patricia Hendricks, director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and her voice carried the weight of an unfolding catastrophe that would test every principle Victoria had claimed to defend. Hurricane Delilah had strengthened to a Category 5 storm in the Gulf of Mexico with unprecedented speed, its eye wall containing winds exceeding 180 miles per hour. The storm's projected path would devastate the entire Louisiana coastline and push storm surge as far inland as Baton Rouge. Nearly 2 million people needed to evacuate within the next 18 hours, but the transportation infrastructure required for such a massive operation was crippled by the TSA crisis Victoria had precipitated. General Hendricks explained the situation with military precision. The Federal Emergency Response Plan relied on a coordinated network of commercial and military aircraft to evacuate vulnerable populations from coastal areas before hurricane conditions made rescue operations impossible.
However, the ongoing TSA operational disruptions had reduced airport capacity across the Southeast by nearly 40%, creating bottlenecks that would prevent the rapid deployment of evacuation flights. The airports most critical to the evacuation effort were operating under the same emergency audits that Victoria had demanded for all facilities using Phoenix cyber defense systems. New Orleans Louis Armstrong International Airport, a primary evacuation hub, was functioning at half capacity due to security system reviews. Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport had been forced to close 2 of its 3 terminals for infrastructure assessments. Mobile Regional Airport was operating with manual screening procedures that could not handle the volume of evacuation flights being planned. Victoria listened to the briefing with growing horror as she realized that her pursuit of justice against TSA had inadvertently compromised the federal government's ability to save lives during a natural disaster. The security systems she had ordered audited were essential in processing the thousands of passengers who needed to be evacuated before the hurricane made landfall. General Hendricks was blunt about the implications. FEMA's evacuation models showed that the reduced airport capacity would prevent the timely departure of approximately 200,000 people who lacked other means of transportation. These were primarily elderly residents of nursing homes, patients in hospitals, and low-income families without access to private vehicles. The demographics of those most at risk mirrored the communities that had historically been failed by inadequate disaster response. The general's request was devastating in its simplicity. Victoria needed to immediately suspend the security audits and restore full operational capacity at all airports in the hurricane's path. Every hour of delay would cost lives as the window for safe evacuation continued to narrow. The very principles of justice and accountability that had driven Victoria's retaliation against TSA were now obstacles to protecting vulnerable populations from a deadly storm. Victoria's initial response revealed the depth of her moral conflict. She argued that suspending the audits would essentially reward TSA for their discriminatory conduct and send a message that security agencies could abuse passengers without consequence as long as they claimed operational necessity. The reforms she had fought for would be abandoned at the first sign of inconvenience, perpetuating the cycle of abuse that had allowed Morrison's misconduct to flourish. General Hendricks countered that the immediate threat to human life outweighed any long-term concerns about TSA accountability. The people facing evacuation were not responsible for Morrison's actions and should not pay for TSA's failures with their lives. The general reminded Victoria that her own security clearances came with an oath to protect American citizens, an obligation that superseded personal grievances against incompetent bureaucrats. The conversation with General Hendricks forced Victoria to confront the uncomfortable reality that her pursuit of perfect justice was preventing imperfect but essential action to protect innocent lives. The moral clarity that had driven her retaliation against TSA was being tested by circumstances that demanded compromise rather than righteousness. Victoria requested 2 hours to consult with her team before making a final decision. She knew that restoring TSA operations would undermine her negotiating position and potentially allow the agency to escape meaningful accountability for their systemic failures. However, she also understood that maintaining her principled stance would make her responsible for preventable deaths during the hurricane evacuation.
The Phoenix Cyber Defense Executive Team convened an emergency meeting via secure video conference to address the crisis. The discussion revealed deep divisions within the company about how to balance their commitment to accountability with their responsibility to public safety. Some executives argued that TSA's incompetence during a natural disaster would provide even stronger evidence for the need for comprehensive reform. Others contended that the company's reputation would be permanently damaged if they appeared to prioritize corporate politics over hurricane evacuations. Michael Zhang, Victoria's Chief Technology Officer, presented the technical challenges involved in rapidly restoring full airport operations. The security audits had identified legitimate vulnerabilities that could not be safely ignored even during emergency operations. However, he believed that temporary workarounds could be implemented within 6 hours to restore most operational capacity while maintaining essential security protocols. Robert Kim, the company's general counsel, outlined the legal implications of suspending the audits.
TSA could argue that the emergency demonstrated the excessive nature of Victoria's original demands and use the suspension as justification for avoiding comprehensive reforms. However, Kim also noted that refusing to assist with hurricane evacuations could expose the company to lawsuits from victims' families and potentially criminal charges for willfully endangering public safety. The most powerful voice in the discussion came from Dr. Lisa Chen, Phoenix Cyber Defense's chief ethics officer and a former federal judge who had joined the company specifically to ensure that their government contracts served the public interest. Chen argued that true accountability required accepting responsibility for the unintended consequences of their actions, not just demanding accountability from others. Chen reminded Victoria that her initial response to TSA misconduct had been motivated by a desire to protect other travelers from discriminatory treatment. Allowing hurricane victims to suffer because of disputes with TSA would betray that original motivation and transform a righteous cause into selfish revenge. The test of Victoria's character was whether she could put the welfare of strangers above her personal desire for vindication. The discussion was interrupted by a call from Senator Reynolds, who had been contacted by FEMA about the emergency. The senator was facing intense pressure from her colleagues to ensure that federal contractors cooperated fully with hurricane response efforts. Reynolds warned Victoria that refusing to assist with evacuations would destroy her credibility with Congress and potentially result in the termination of all Phoenix cyber defense contracts with the federal government. Reynolds also provided political context that complicated Victoria's decision. Several members of Congress who had initially supported her fight against TSA discrimination were now questioning whether her response had been proportionate to the original offense. The hurricane evacuation crisis would give these critics an opportunity to argue that Victoria cared more about personal grievances than public safety, potentially undermining support for the TSA reform she had fought to achieve. Victoria found herself facing the same impossible choice that had confronted every civil rights leader who had challenged unjust systems. Maintaining moral purity often required accepting that imperfect progress was better than perfect inaction. The hurricane evacuation demanded that she choose between her desire for complete accountability and her responsibility to protect vulnerable populations. The decision was further complicated by a call from Morrison's attorney, who offered to have the former TSA supervisor publicly apologize and accept responsibility for her discriminatory conduct in exchange for the immediate restoration of airport operations. The offer represented everything Victoria had originally sought: acknowledgement of wrongdoing, accountability for misconduct, and a commitment to preventing future abuse. However, the context of the offer felt like extortion rather than justice. Morrison was attempting to leverage a natural disaster to escape the consequences of her actions, using hurricane victims as human shields to protect herself from accountability. Accepting the deal would achieve Victoria's stated goals, but would also establish a precedent that federal employees could avoid consequences for misconduct by creating public emergencies. Victoria's final consultation was with her mother, retired school principal Eleanor Hayes, who had remained her most trusted advisor despite having no direct involvement in her daughter's business affairs. Eleanor listened to the entire situation without interruption, then delivered the guidance that would ultimately determine Victoria's choice. Eleanor reminded Victoria that the civil rights movement had succeeded, not because its leaders were perfect, but because they were willing to sacrifice personal satisfaction for the greater good. The test of moral leadership was whether someone could maintain their principles while adapting their tactics to serve the people they claimed to protect. Fighting for justice required wisdom and compassion, not just righteousness and power. The conversation with her mother crystallized Victoria's understanding of the choice she faced. She could maintain her perfect moral position and allow hurricane victims to suffer for TSA's sins, or she could demonstrate the kind of leadership that put human welfare above personal vindication. The decision would define not just her response to the current crisis, but her legacy as a leader who claimed to fight for justice. Victoria's final decision reflected a maturity that had been forged in the crucible of unintended consequences. She would restore airport operations to enable the hurricane evacuation, but she would not abandon her fight for TSA accountability. Instead, she would use the goodwill generated by her cooperation during the emergency to build broader support for comprehensive reform.
The call to General Hendricks came at 6:15 a.m., exactly 2 hours and 28 minutes after their initial conversation. Victoria's voice was steady as she announced that Phoenix Cyber Defense would immediately begin restoring full operational capacity at all airports needed for hurricane evacuations. The work would begin within 30 minutes and be completed within 6 hours, in time to support the afternoon evacuation flights that would save thousands of lives. The decision to prioritize hurricane victims over personal vindication represented a fundamental evolution in Victoria's understanding of power and responsibility. She had learned that true strength sometimes required accepting imperfect solutions rather than demanding perfect justice, and that leadership meant serving others even when they could not reciprocate. Hurricane Delilah made landfall 18 hours after Victoria's decision to restore airport operations, bringing with it storm surge that reached 23 feet in some coastal areas and winds that sustained 175 miles per hour for over 6 hours. The evacuation effort that Victoria had enabled saved an estimated 180,000 lives, including entire nursing homes, hospital wards, and low-income housing complexes that would have been completely destroyed by the storm. The success of the hurricane response created an unexpected opportunity for Victoria to rebuild her relationship with federal agencies while maintaining pressure for comprehensive TSA reform. Her cooperation during the crisis had demonstrated that Phoenix Cyber Defense could be a responsible partner even while demanding accountability, giving her moral authority that pure confrontation could never have achieved. 3 weeks after the hurricane, Victoria received a call from newly appointed TSA Administrator Rebecca Torres, a former Air Force general who had been brought in to clean up the agency following Administrator Peterson's resignation in disgrace. Torres had spent her first weeks in office conducting a comprehensive review of TSA operations and had concluded that the agency needed fundamental restructuring rather than cosmetic reforms. Torres proposed a meeting at a neutral location to discuss a new framework for airport security that would address the systemic problems Victoria's case had exposed while restoring operational stability to the transportation system. The administrator acknowledged that TSA had failed to live up to its responsibilities and proposed that Phoenix Cyber Defense play a central role in designing and implementing reforms that would prevent future incidents of discrimination and abuse. The meeting took place at the Federal Executive Institute in Charlottesville, Virginia, a government training facility that provided the privacy and security necessary for sensitive negotiations. Victoria arrived with a small team that included Michael Zhang, Robert Kim, and Dr. Lisa Chen, while Torres brought deputy administrators responsible for operations, training, and civil rights compliance. Torres opened the negotiations with a remarkable admission of institutional failure. She acknowledged that TSA had developed a culture that prioritized the appearance of security over actual security effectiveness, leading to the kind of discriminatory enforcement that had characterized Morrison's conduct. The administrator presented internal data showing that secondary screening procedures were disproportionately applied to minority passengers without any corresponding increase in actual security threats identified. The data Torres shared was damning in its comprehensiveness. African American passengers were 3.7 times more likely to be selected for additional screening than white passengers, despite being statistically less likely to pose actual security risks. Hispanic passengers faced similar disparities, while passengers with Middle Eastern names were subject to additional scrutiny at rates that were completely divorced from any legitimate threat assessment. Victoria responded by presenting her own analysis of TSA's operational failures, based on Phoenix Cyber Defense's extensive monitoring of airport security systems.
Her data showed that the agency's focus on performative security measures had actually made airports less safe by creating predictable patterns that sophisticated threats could exploit, while wasting resources on harassment of innocent passengers.
The negotiations that followed were unlike any previous discussion between a government contractor and a federal agency. Rather than focusing on technical specifications or financial terms, the conversation centered on fundamental questions about the purpose and methods of airport security in a democratic society. Victoria's primary demand was the establishment of an independent oversight board with the authority to investigate discrimination complaints, review security procedures, and impose disciplinary measures on TSA personnel who violated civil rights. The board would include representatives from civil rights organizations, passenger advocacy groups, and security professionals, ensuring that TSA could not simply police itself as it had done for decades. Torres accepted the oversight board concept, but proposed that it be structured as a joint initiative between TSA and the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. This structure would give the board more authority and resources while ensuring that its findings would carry weight throughout the federal government rather than being isolated within TSA. The second major component of Victoria's proposal was a complete overhaul of TSA training programs to emphasize de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and constitutional rights. She proposed that all TSA personnel, from frontline agents to senior supervisors, complete annual training programs that would be developed jointly by Phoenix Cyber Defense, civil rights organizations, and academic experts in bias prevention. Torres not only accepted this proposal, but expanded it to include psychological evaluation and ongoing assessment of personnel who showed patterns of discriminatory behavior. The administrator proposed creating a national database that would track complaints against individual agents across all airports, preventing problematic personnel from simply transferring to new locations when their misconduct was discovered. The third element of the reform framework addressed the technology systems that Victoria's company had developed for TSA. Victoria proposed modifying the threat assessment algorithms to include bias detection mechanisms that would flag when screening decisions appeared to be based on racial or ethnic profiling rather than legitimate security concerns. These technological safeguards would operate in real time, alerting supervisors when agents were disproportionately targeting passengers from specific demographic groups. The system would also generate monthly reports analyzing screening patterns to identify systemic bias that might not be apparent in individual cases. Torres embraced the technological approach, but requested that it be expanded to include predictive analytics that could identify potential discrimination before it occurred. She proposed using machine learning algorithms to analyze agent behavior patterns and provide early intervention when personnel showed signs of developing discriminatory practices. The most innovative aspect of the new framework was Victoria's proposal for a passenger advocacy program that would provide real-time support for travelers who believed they were being subjected to discriminatory treatment. Passengers could use a mobile app to request immediate intervention from trained advocates who would observe screening procedures and ensure that TSA agents followed proper protocols. The advocacy program would be staffed by civil rights attorneys, former TSA agents who had demonstrated exemplary conduct, and community representatives from organizations serving frequently targeted populations. Advocates would have the authority to stop screening procedures that violated established protocols and to ensure that passengers received fair treatment throughout the security process. Torres supported the advocacy program, but proposed expanding it to include a rapid response team that could be deployed to airports where discrimination complaints were particularly common.
This team would conduct on-site training, review local procedures, and implement corrective measures before problems escalated to the level of Victoria's case. The financial aspects of the reform framework reflected the scope of changes being proposed. Victoria agreed to modify Phoenix Cyber Defense's existing contracts to include the bias detection technology and oversight systems at no additional cost to the government, viewing this as both a corporate responsibility and an investment in long-term business relationships. TSA committed to funding the training programs, advocacy services, and oversight board operations through budget reallocations, rather than requesting additional appropriations from Congress. Torres argued that the cost of comprehensive reform would be offset by reduced litigation expenses and improved operational efficiency resulting from better trained personnel. The reform framework also addressed accountability for past misconduct. Morrison and the agents who had participated in Victoria's harassment were permanently barred from federal employment, with their cases serving as precedents for disciplinary actions against other personnel who violated civil rights. TSA agreed to conduct systematic reviews of discrimination complaints that had been previously dismissed or inadequately investigated. Victoria insisted that the reforms include a public transparency component that would make TSA's progress measurable and verifiable. Monthly reports would be published detailing screening statistics by demographic category, discrimination complaints received and resolved, and disciplinary actions taken against personnel who violated protocols. The transparency requirements extended to TSA's training programs, with curricula and assessment results being made available for public review. This openness was designed to ensure that the reforms could not be quietly abandoned when public attention moved to other issues. The most significant long-term component of the framework was the establishment of a permanent civil rights office within TSA, headed by a deputy administrator with direct reporting authority to the Secretary of Homeland Security. This office would have the resources and authority to investigate systemic discrimination and implement corrective measures without interference from operational personnel who might prioritize efficiency over civil rights. The negotiations concluded with an agreement that transformed TSA from an agency that had actively resisted accountability into one that would be subject to unprecedented oversight and transparency. Victoria had achieved more comprehensive reform than seemed possible during her darkest moments of humiliation at the Seattle checkpoint. The signing ceremony took place at TSA headquarters, with representatives from major civil rights organizations and congressional leaders in attendance. Victoria's remarks emphasized that the framework represented not just a victory for her personally, but a commitment to ensuring that no other passenger would face the discrimination and abuse that had been routine within TSA. Torres used the ceremony to announce that the reforms would be implemented within 6 months and that TSA would accept independent monitoring to ensure compliance. The administrator acknowledged that changing the agency's culture would require sustained effort and commitment, but expressed confidence that the new framework provided the tools necessary for transformation. The media coverage of the reform framework was overwhelmingly positive, with editorial boards across the country praising both Victoria's persistence in demanding accountability and TSA's willingness to accept comprehensive change. The story had evolved from a tale of personal revenge to a model for how systemic discrimination could be addressed through determined advocacy and institutional reform. Victoria returned to Seattle with a sense of accomplishment that was deeper and more meaningful than the satisfaction she had felt during TSA's initial collapse. She had proven that power could be used not just to punish wrongdoing, but to create systems that prevented future injustice while serving the public interest.
The framework she had negotiated would outlast any individual administrator or political administration, creating permanent changes that would protect future generations of travelers from the discrimination she had experienced. Her humiliation at the hands of Morrison and her colleagues had been transformed into a legacy of institutional reform that would serve the cause of civil rights for decades to come. 3 years after Victoria Hayes transformed TSA through her comprehensive reform framework, a new challenge emerged that would test whether her changes could survive determined opposition from powerful interests seeking to restore the old system of unchecked authority and discriminatory enforcement. The threat came from Senator Richard Blackwood, a presidential candidate who had built his campaign around promises to eliminate what he called woke bureaucracy from federal agencies. Blackwood had targeted Victoria's TSA reforms as a prime example of how civil rights concerns were allegedly weakening national security, promising to dismantle the oversight mechanisms she had created if elected president. The senator's strategy centered on exploiting a new security incident that occurred at Boston Logan International Airport. A passenger named David Kim had been selected for additional screening by Victoria's bias detection algorithms, which flagged unusual patterns in his travel history and identification documents. However, when TSA agents attempted to conduct the secondary screening, Kim became agitated and accused them of racial profiling. The incident escalated when Kim, who was actually an undercover federal investigator testing security procedures, refused to comply with screening protocols and demanded to speak with supervisors. The confrontation was recorded by other passengers and quickly went viral on social media, showing what appeared to be discriminatory treatment of an Asian American traveler. Blackwood seized on the video to argue that Victoria's reforms had created a system where agents were afraid to conduct necessary security checks due to fear of discrimination complaints. He claimed that political correctness was making airports vulnerable to terrorist attacks and that only a return to common-sense security measures could protect American travelers. The senator's allegations gained traction when it was revealed that Kim was indeed a federal investigator, but his true mission remained classified. Blackwood used this information to suggest that TSA agents had failed to detect a potential threat due to concerns about civil rights violations, creating a narrative that seemed to validate his criticism of Victoria's reforms. Victoria found herself facing the most serious challenge to her work since the original confrontation with Morrison. Unlike previous critics who had attacked her reforms from the margins, Blackwood was a mainstream political figure with genuine prospects of winning the presidency and implementing his promises to roll back civil rights protections. Her response began with a careful investigation of the Boston incident that revealed crucial details Blackwood had omitted from his public statements. Working with her contacts in federal law enforcement, Victoria discovered that Kim had been conducting an authorized security test and that TSA agents had actually performed exactly as they were supposed to under the reformed protocols. The bias detection algorithms correctly identified unusual patterns in Kim's documentation because he was using false credentials as part of his undercover assignment. TSA agents had followed proper procedures in requesting additional screening, and their decision to escalate the situation when Kim became non-compliant was entirely appropriate under both old and new protocols. Victoria's investigation also revealed that Kim's apparent anger during the screening was part of his assigned role as an undercover investigator, testing how TSA agents would respond to an uncooperative passenger. His behavior had been deliberately designed to create exactly the kind of confrontation that Blackwood was now using to attack the reform framework. The most damaging revelation was that Blackwood had been briefed on the true nature of the Boston incident by federal law enforcement officials, but had chosen to misrepresent it publicly for political advantage. The senator was knowingly using a successful security operation to argue that security reforms were failing, demonstrating either incompetence or deliberate deception. Victoria's public response came during a nationally televised interview where she systematically dismantled Blackwood's arguments while revealing the classified details she had been authorized to discuss. Her presentation combined technical expertise with moral authority, showing both why the Boston incident actually validated her reforms and how Blackwood's misrepresentation endangered national security. The interview became a turning point in the presidential campaign, as Victoria's credibility and expertise contrasted sharply with Blackwood's political opportunism. Her calm, fact-based approach highlighted the senator's reliance on fear-mongering and misinformation, undermining his broader campaign message about competent leadership. Blackwood responded to Victoria's revelations with defensive and increasingly desperate actions. He accused her of using classified information for political purposes, despite the fact that federal officials had authorized her disclosures. His attacks became personal, questioning her patriotism and suggesting that her civil rights advocacy was motivated by anti-American sentiment.
The senator's increasingly erratic behavior alienated moderate voters who had been attracted to his promises of government efficiency. His inability to respond substantively to Victoria's technical arguments made clear that his criticism of TSA reforms was based on political calculation rather than genuine security concerns. Victoria's defense of her reforms gained support from unexpected sources, including several Republican members of Congress who had initially been skeptical of civil rights oversight but had come to recognize its effectiveness. These officials provided bipartisan validation that the reformed system was actually working better than its predecessor. The campaign controversy also prompted a comprehensive review of TSA operations by the Government Accountability Office, which found that airports using Victoria's reformed procedures had improved both security effectiveness and civil rights compliance. The GAO report provided independent validation that her approach had achieved its intended goals without compromising safety. Blackwood's presidential campaign never recovered from his confrontation with Victoria. His misrepresentation of the Boston incident became a symbol of his broader credibility problems, and he withdrew from the race 6 months before the election. His political career effectively ended when subsequent investigations revealed his financial connections to the private security companies that had funded his attacks on TSA reforms. The successful defense of her reforms against such a high-profile political attack confirmed that Victoria had created sustainable institutional change rather than temporary policy adjustments. The system she had built had survived not just because it was legally mandated, but because it had proven its value in practice and built constituencies committed to its preservation. Victoria's role in defeating Blackwood's challenge established her as a permanent guardian of civil rights progress in federal security operations. Her expertise and credibility had become resources that could be deployed against future threats to the reforms she had created. The broader impact of Victoria's victory extended beyond airport security to influence civil rights enforcement across multiple federal agencies. Her success demonstrated that systematic discrimination could be effectively challenged and that reforms could be designed to withstand political pressure and legal challenges. 5 years after her original humiliation at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Victoria received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her contributions to civil rights and national security. The ceremony recognized her transformation from victim to reformer to guardian of institutional progress. Victoria's acceptance speech emphasized that lasting change required continuous vigilance against those who would exploit temporary setbacks to justify permanent regression. Her story had proven that individual actions, when properly directed and sustained, could reshape institutions and protect future generations from discrimination.
The medal represented validation of her belief that power should be used not just to punish wrongdoing, but to create systems that prevented future injustice. Victoria Hayes had turned her worst moment into a permanent victory for civil rights that would endure long after her personal involvement ended.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.